Right. Let's get something out of the way, okay? This video is not about whether or not AI can make art. I already gave my opinion on that. The real question is, how did it learn to make art? Right? And another part is, why does the law say it's okay? You know? Because every image, every melody, every performance that an artificial intelligence can give, it comes from somewhere. The systems aren't created in a vacuum, right? They're trained on mass databases created by humans, of human work that took humans years of refinement, of honing their abilities, of being able to produce this work through failure and trying again and again and again until they got it. It's trained on these resources. Work that took years out of every individual person's life in order for it to achieve that. And for the most part, the people who made this work weren't asked for consent. There was no consent, really. I mean, we see it in the way that the response to artificial intelligence and generative AI is being handled on social media by those who have been producing the art that the artificial intelligence is trained on, right? There was no real notification to these people, and there's no real compensation because, well, if it's on the internet, it must be fine, right? But when artists object to this, right? When artists say, I don't want my thing, my work, my hard effort to be used to train an artificial intelligence that will take the thing that I love doing away from me, they are told by those who would constantly support this as a net positive that it is a legal process and that even though it's taken unfairly, it's inevitable and it's progress, right? So how did we even get here? Think about this, right? If a human copied thousands of artists, just copied their styles to the T, and sold the results, we'd call that plagiarism. It's not socially acceptable. In an academic setting, we would oust that person. If a company did it manually, right, we'd call it exploitation. But when artificial intelligence does it, when a machine does it at such an industrial scale, the law says it's legal and people support it because, it gives people the feeling that they are creating something of their own. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but the problem is the oversaturation of the markets in which these are being pushed forward in, right? And that contradiction that we see, the fact that we will so willingly call plagiarism out in cases that aren't artificial intelligence, this contradiction that sits at the center of AI art and music debate, it's not accidental. Current intellectual property law, just like a lot of laws of our time, weren't designed for artificial intelligence. It was written for a world where copying took a lot of effort, where authorship was human, and where infringement was very visible when you saw it. But instead of updating these laws to keep track with the modern society that we live within, what happens is that courts and corporations are really just protecting these old laws, stretching the old definitions until they inevitably break, right? All to justify something that we've never seen before, something unprecedented, and that is the mass extraction of creative labor without permission. And look, it's not about being technophobic, right? I have no real problem when it comes to artificial intelligence as a tool to support humanity. This isn't even about artists, quote unquote, hating new tools. And it's not about stopping progress. It's about questioning the power that these sorts of things have in inherently human fields. When the law protects those who want to scrape culture out of every bit of whatever thing they have access to, right? We're not witnessing a legal gray area. It's a system that's fundamentally is choosing a side. And right now, it's really not choosing the side of the artists, is it? Okay, let's get started on how artificial intelligence is trained, right? To understand why artists are angry and why the law is really struggling to keep up here, we need to strip away the mystique around artificial intelligence. Ooh, it's so scary. Despite how it's marketed, generative AI doesn't think. It doesn't imagine. It doesn't feel. And it's definitely not inspired, you know? It learns by consuming enormous amounts of existing work from the internet. And they see this human work, right? And they identify patterns through it, which means that when you really generate something from artificial intelligence, you're not making art. At least I don't think so personally. What you're making is a series of patterns smushed together to create an entirely quote unquote new piece of art that is entirely derivative of previous works. For image models, right? What that means is millions and often even billions of pictures are scraped from the internet, right? And they're kind of pushed together. The artificial intelligence identifies the color patterns, right? The drawing styles, how lines are used within artwork, and it uses that and it pushes it together to create the image that you request. For music, like I described before, it takes songs and snippets and strip down the basest musical element of it, and they identify the components that make a song, and then they combine those to create a new song. This process, it's called training. During training, the artificial intelligence system is shown a piece of work. And what it does is that it's told, right, in very, very simple terms, this is what this thing looks like, or this is what this thing sounds like. And then over time, it develops these statistical relationships. What shapes go together, what chord progressions are familiar to people, what vocal inflections signal emotion, right? And importantly, the system is not learning facts. It's not just learning facts, it's learning the style of people, right? Because all style really is just patterns that people tend to go with. And that's where it gets complicated. Because style is not a copyrightable thing. We see it so much in the music industry where people try to copyright the sound of something. And always that's been thrown out of court. Let's look at, say, Marvin Gaye's household with Pharrell Williams and Robin Thicke. That case was highly publicized, and even in that case, there was a lot of controversy around the court ruling that style was not copyrightable, yet the Marvin Gaye household would still get a cut of the money because the song sounded like a Marvin Gaye song. Or how about that time Ed Sheeran got sent to court because he sounded familiar? You can't own the idea of the brush strokes of a certain artist, right? You can't own the idea of a genre or a vocal timbre, right? But in practice, the style that an artist develops is the entire labor, is the entire work that goes into creating the art. Because without a style, the artist can't create the art. It's what clients hire these people for. It's how musicians are recognized, right? Do you think Tyler the Creator would have been as big as he is if he hadn't had such a instinctively recognizable style. Do you think Kendrick Lamar would be where he is today if he hadn't donned the mantle of backpack rap with J. Cole? No, probably not, if you really think about it. Right? And the problem is, all of these things are how careers are built. AI training absorbs that labor at like an industrial scale. Most of this data is gathered through automated scraping, right? Software that copies publicly available material en masse. And the argument for artificial intelligence companies is very simple. If something is publicly available, it's fair game. And if it's not being redistributed verbatim, it's not infringement, which, to be fair, is true. But what this ignores is a crucial detail, right? Publicly visible does not mean freely usable. There's a big difference there. Artists put their work online to be seen, to be commissioned, to be appreciated, not to be ingested into commercial systems that can replace them. The internet was built for sharing between people, not for machines to silently extract value from creators without their consent. Do you see what I mean? And in most cases, right, artists don't even know that this is happening. They don't know it's happening until it's way too late. And the models have already been trained on their work. Opt-out systems, when they exist at all, by the way, usually come out later. They place the burden on creators to protect themselves from something they never agreed to in the first place. That reversal from consent to damage control, right, is one of the most telling signs that a system is fundamentally broken. And at this stage, defenders of AI often respond with reassurance. They say, oh, models don't store images or songs. They say nothing is being directly copied. Everything is taken apart and then put back together in a new form. They say the outputs themselves are new, right? And technically, they're not entirely wrong, right? But legality isn't the same thing as legitimacy. Because even if no single artwork is actually reproduced, the system's ability to generate art or music depends entirely on the uncredited, uncompensated labor of countless human creators dead and alive. Without that foundation, that means nothing. So when we talk about AI-generated art and music, right, we're not talking about creativity emerging from nothing, right? We're talking about culture being mined. We're talking about culture being abstracted and resold, with the law really not doing much to protect the creators. And that uncertainty is exactly what allows for abuse to be possible. The real harm, what gets lost when the law looks away. When critics defend AI training practices, they often ask the same question. Where's the harm? After all, no single artwork is missing. No original song has vanished from existence. Nothing was taken in the traditional sense. So where's the harm? Right? But harm doesn't need to be visible for it to exist. And the damage caused by generative AI in art and music in a commercial setting, it's not about one stolen image or one copied melody. It's about a buildup, right? It's about erosion, a slow, cumulative, and devastating erosion. There's economic harm first, right? Illustrators, composers, voice actors, even designers, right, are increasingly competing against systems trained on their own work. Clients who once commissioned artists now ask for AI-assisted alternatives. Rates drop, jobs disappear, and when artists push back, right, they're told the machine is cheaper, faster, and good enough, at least by corporations. The response on people who really, really love AI is, why do your job? You don't need it. And usually it just so happens that those people are the billionaires pushing artificial intelligence. There's something to be said there, but moving on from that, the law rarely recognizes the economic harm that generative AI causes because it demands direct causation. It asks artists to prove that there is a very specific, visible output that copied a specific work, but that standard ignores how markets actually function. You don't need to you don't need to steal one painting to collapse an industry, right? The Louvre heist really proved that. You just need to flood it with substitutes. There's creative harm as well, right? Artists don't just lose income, they lose control over their own identity within the realm of the thing that they're trying to do. And when an AI model can replicate a recognizable sound or style, it dilutes the meaning of originality. An artist's voice becomes a prompt, their aesthetic, just a little preset button. Years of experimentation and risk by these artists are flattened into something anyone can create in seconds. And unlike human influence, this imitation doesn't come with dialogue or credit or lineage, right? There's no acknowledgement of inspiration, only a replication without this real relationship. And that changes how culture evolves, right? Instead of artists responding to each other, what we get is machines remixing the past endlessly, like the music industry is trying to do these days on its own. And it reinforces what already exists. Think about music for a second, right? And how saturated the market is these days. Have you, this year, heard about an artist called Geese? I'm sure some of you have, those of you who are tapped into the rock genre, but a lot of you, I'm sure, haven't. Have you guys heard about Clips's new album? Clips's new album, Let God Sort 'Em Out? I'm sure you have if you like certain bits of rap, but chances are you haven't because there's not that many streams on Spotify. Have you heard of Ka, the New York-based rapper who died in 2024, but his art is very much symbolizes a almost experimental hip-hop sound that doesn't mesh with anything else in the experimental scene. It's not loud, it's not noisy, it really just works on its own. It does its own thing with very dark imagery that often relates back to religion. Have you heard of I don't know, The Who? I'm sure you have. Like, they're a very old rock band, but a lot of people haven't. And my point there is, in an industry that's so saturated with music, right? It doesn't matter what you create. It doesn't matter how you make your art, just as long as it's quote unquote art. And artificial intelligence does that very cheaply, very efficiently, and very quickly. And that makes it so that people like the very, 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 very good rock band Geese are unable to break into the mainstream. That makes it so that artists like Ka can't break into the mainstream because there's so many things, so many factors preventing them from entering the music scene already, the mainstream music scene, that isn't AI. So when AI comes into the picture, that pushes them out entirely. Third, there's a psychological harm that is very much dismissed within the realm of a lot of people using this artificial intelligence, people promoting this artificial intelligence. For many creators, right, art and music and all that, it's not a hobby. Their identity, their expression, their meaning, they have this sort of very intrinsic value to them because they're pouring their soul out into this thing. Discovering that your work has been absorbed into a system, right, that you've never consented to, used in ways you can't control, and deployed to compete against you it's profoundly destabilizing. It creates a sense of disposition, and there's a mining there instead of a being heard by the masses, you know? And when artists speak about this, they're framed as irrational, emotional, or afraid of change, but fear isn't the issue here. Powerlessness is. I'm a writer. I consider myself a writer, at least. It's the one thing I'm really good at. And the feeling I have watching a lot of things turn towards the realm of artificial intelligence really irritates me, I think, because the people around me, right? A lot of the people around me aren't cautious of artificial intelligence. And as such, they believe that artificial intelligence will be the entire future in terms of creative arts. And that really affects me in a negative way. I love writing. I write all the time. It's the one thing I do pretty much constantly. And what happens there when I see artificial intelligence taking work from creators I admire and using it to generate stories that are written in like 5 seconds, it's really disturbing psychologically, truly. And the law offers no real protection from this. There's no meaningful recourse, no seat at the table where these decisions are being made without the creative's decisions. And what makes this worse is that the burden of proof is being inverted. The artists are asked to demonstrate that the harm caused by companies they can't inspect, trained on data sets they can't see, operated by companies that claim proprietary secrecy. Meanwhile, these companies are free to profit and justify later, right? This isn't neutrality, it's negligence. When legal systems fail to recognize economic displacement, creative dilution, and psychological damage as legitimate harms, they effectively declare them acceptable collateral. And once harm is normalized, exploitation does not need to hide any longer. If visual art shows how artificial intelligence exploits labor, music and voice can really reveal something very unsettling. What's taken here isn't just style, right? Maybe compositionally, sure, but in terms of the voice, it's identity. A musician's voice isn't an abstract technique. It's shaped by things that they can't really control, right? The anatomy of their body, the culture that they are raised in, the language that they first learn, and their lived experience, right? It's as personal as your fingerprint. And in many cases, it's just as recognizable because your voice is how you communicate. It's the baseline for everything that you say and the way people think of you. Yet voice models are trained on hours of people speaking and singing, and often scraped from like interviews, performances, online content without permission. And once trained, these systems can reproduce tone, cadence, emotion, everything that makes a voice human, while the person it came from is reduced to literal raw data. Legally, that's a gray zone, which is a problem, really. Copyright protects songs, not voices. You can't copyright your voice, as far as I know. And performers' rights vary wildly by jurisdiction, right? Sound-alike protections are narrow and often favor celebrities over working artists. And for most musicians and voice actors, the law simply doesn't know what to do with the idea that a machine can wear their voice without ever copying a single recording, right? So it allows it. The result is a deeply unequal system. Well-known artists may have the resources to sue or license their likeness. Everyone else is just told to accept imitation as flattery or innovation, because imitation is the greatest form of flattery that the mediocre can play the great. Emphasis on that last bit. The mediocre can pay the great. AI generated vocals are already used for commercials, demos, background tracks, even full songs, right? Cutting human performers out of the equation pretty much entirely. And when harm is alleged, the defense is familiar. They say the voice is inspired by, not copied. They say it's statistically generated. They say no single recording was ever copied. They say it's still creative because you had to write the prompt to it. But again, legality is not the same as legitimacy. If someone has built a synthetic version of your voice and spoke words you never have, sang songs you never recorded, or represent values you don't hold, the impact would be immediate, personal, reputational, and irreversible. That's why voice feels different. Because unlike an image style, right, or a musical genre, a voice carries trust. It carries authorship. It carries the idea, oh, it's this person's voice. Of course they did it, right? It carries responsibility. When it's severed from the human being it belongs to, the consequences often lie far beyond art. And yet, the law treats this as a very niche problem, a novelty even, rather than a warning. What makes this especially dangerous is how easily it can scale in size. Once a voice is captured, right, it can be replicated infinitely. There's no exhaustion, no consent checkpoint, no meaningful way to reclaim control. The performer becomes optional while their identity remains profitable. The only barrier between the use of a person's voice and the artificial intelligence using it is a paywall. And in this framework, right, musicians and voice actors are no longer creators. The data sets to be assimilated into the hive mind, right? And the legal system, by refusing to recognize voice and sound as protected extensions of personhood, they enable that reduction, because when identity can be extracted, reproduced, monetized without consent, the question is no longer about art or technology, it's about the ownership of the self. Who is the law actually protecting? At this point, as tempting as it is to say the law has simply fallen behind, that it's outdated, that it needs time to catch up, I think that explanation is a little bit too generous. When we look closely, the law isn't absent, it's selective. Intellectual property is enforced aggressively when corporations are threatened. Copyright strikes are quick. Cease and desist letters arrive immediately. Entire platforms are taken down to protect brand assets, trademarks, proprietary technology. But when artists challenge AI companies for using their work without consent, the response slows. Cases drag on. Responsibility is diffused, and judges emphasize uncertainty, novelty, and technical complexity. And that isn't an accident. The legal system is structurally better at handling disputes between entities with money, fame, and legal teams. AI companies frame their actions as abstract technical processes, training, modeling, optimization, while artists, right, are forced to argue from personal harm and ethical violation. One side speaks the language of systems, the other speaks the language of survival. And usually, and this is true to a lot of life, the systems win. There's also a narrative advantage here, right? AI companies position themselves as the builders of neutral tools. They don't create the output, users do, so they aren't responsible for it. They don't choose the data, the internet does. Responsibility is always somewhere else, delegated to something or someone else, and it's always just out of reach. This fragmentation is legally very convenient. If no one is responsible, then no one can be held accountable. If harm is to diffuse, then it's easier to dismiss. The law, which prefers clear lines and individual fault, quietly steps back. Meanwhile, artists are told to adapt, quote unquote. They're encouraged to use AI themselves as if participation erases exploitation, which it never does. As if being forced into the same system that displaced you is empowerment. It's taking control of your own destiny rather than coercion. It's not. What this reveals is not a legal vacuum, but a hierarchy, a ranked order, if you must. Innovation is prioritized over labor. Progress is prioritized over human creativity. Scale is rewarded over consent, and corporate risk is protected more carefully than human livelihood. The law does not ask us whether artists agreed or not. It asks whether companies can continue operating, and that tells us everything. When legal frameworks consistently favor those who extract value over those who produce it, they stop functioning as protections and start functioning as permissions. Permissions to scrape, to imitate, to replace even. This is why the artificial intelligence debate cannot be reduced to just progress versus fear, can't be reduced to everybody who is not on the side of artificial intelligence is just afraid of technology or just doesn't know how to use it, right? We have to ask, who is the progress for? A lot of the time we see that we talk about progress as if it's always a net positive when it's not. Was discovering the new world really a net positive? How could it be a net positive when millions of people were killed by diseases brought over? How could it be a net positive when the largest active metropolitan area in the early 1700s was destroyed by disease? Progress isn't always a good thing. Progress is actually, a lot of the time, a net negative for the world. Other than like healthcare, of course. So what I'm saying is that the point of it all, progress for the sake of progress, is not a positive thing. It's not a good thing. And oftentimes we see that, especially in the modern day and age, a lot of people confuse progress for the sake of humanity and progress for the sake of progress. If the future of creativity depends on systems that hollow out the very people that make culture possible, and the law isn't lagging behind technologically. It's actively shaping who gets to survive it. Let's talk about something I like to call the myth of inevitable progress. Every defense of artificial intelligence really reaches the same conclusion at the end, that it's inevitable, right? No matter what the actual defense is, the substance of the actual defense, right? Whether it's there's no point in not trying to go along with artificial intelligence because it's the future, or whether it's artificial intelligence is a good thing and it's a net positive for society, always reaches the same conclusion. That artificial intelligence and its usage in everyday life and in all avenues and in all respects of life is inevitable. So go along with it. Artists are told that attempts of resistance are futile, that technology always disrupts, that history rewards those who adapt and forgets those who don't, right? The implication is clear. Even if you're harmed by artificial intelligence, the problem isn't the system, it's your refusal to accept it. But inevitability is a story we tell after the decisions have already been made. Nothing about the current artificial intelligence landscape is unavoidable, right? Companies choose to scrape instead of license. Legislators choose to wait instead of legislate or regulate even. Courts choose caution over intervention, and each step of the way is paved with quote unquote good intentions. Each step is framed as temporary, as pragmatic or neutral until it becomes permanent. Calling this progress really disguises the agency that humans have within the situation. Because you call it progress, you remove the fact that all people have choice within the actions that they make. Of course, there is something to be said about the fact that the everyday average man's choice matters far less than the billionaires choosing to develop artificial intelligence, but that's besides the point. True technological progress expands human capacity without erasing human dignity. It creates new possibilities without demanding silent sacrifice for those least able to absorb the cost of this progress. What we're seeing is acceleration without accountability. We see speed treated as virtue and scale treated as justification, but history doesn't support the idea that exploitation is the price of innovation, right? And there is something to be said that in the wake of difficult topics and difficult things, oftentimes we see progress being made. Oftentimes progress is made at the expense of people, but exploitation is never a necessary thing for progress, right? Child labor was once inevitable. Slavery was once inevitable. Environmental destruction is, quote unquote, inevitable. Unregulated factories are, quote unquote, inevitable. And in every case, inevitability is a choice. One made by those who benefit most from delay. And artificial intelligence is really no different from that. The framing of resistance as fear is particularly effective, right? Because it shifts blame. Artists aren't allowed to object on ethical grounds because, oh no, you're not objecting because morally you feel that you shouldn't be doing this. It's because you're afraid. Wow, what a wimp, right? They have to prove economic usefulness at this point. And their consent, it's irrelevant. Objections are emotional and irrational. Labor is outdated, and that is how power avoids scrutiny. In every case, in every scenario, that's how it happens. You shift the blame onto the people that are the victims of the situation. By the time the public realizes that something was lost, careers, diversity of expression, human connection to art, the system will already be entrenched. And those who wanted to warn against it, those who did warn against it, will be rewritten as obstacles to inevitability, to eternity, rather than witnesses. But inevitability often collapses under one simple question, right? Who decided this? And who benefited? Progress without consent isn't progress. Automation without accountability isn't innovation. And a future built on uncredited human labor isn't artificial intelligence. It's just extraction of human value, just automated. The law really doesn't have to accept this trajectory. Society doesn't have to either. But as long as inevitability is treated as truth rather than rhetoric, meaningful change will always arrive a little bit too late. This is a segment in the video that I like to call wishful thinking, right? Criticizing the current system is really only useful if we can imagine something better, right? And because opposing exploitative AI practices doesn't necessarily mean rejecting artificial intelligence as a whole, it means rejecting the idea that innovation requires depossession. That artists must lose their control over their works or technology can advance. Ethical artificial intelligence law begins with a simple shift in assumption. Consent is not optional. Training data should be opt-in, not opt-out. Artists should be asked before their work is used, not informed after the fact. If they're informed at all, really. This is already how we treat medicinal data, biometric data, and human subjects in research. Creative labor deserves the same respect. Then comes compensation, right? If artificial intelligence systems value learning from human work, then that work is not incidental, it's foundational. Licensing models, collective bargaining structures, or revenue sharing systems could ensure that artists are paid for and paid for the use of their contributions, even when those contributions are abstracted into data sets. This isn't unprecedented, right? Music streaming already operates on complex royalty systems. And stock photography, sample libraries, all these things already license at scale. The infrastructure exists. What's missing is the will. And then there's transparency, which is obviously very important. So artists can't protect their rights if they don't know how their work is being used, right? Ethical law would require disclosure of training sources, dataset composition, and model capabilities. Trade secrecy should not override basic accountability, especially when systems directly affect livelihoods. For music and voice, the protections have to go further because voices are identity. Voices should be treated as extensions of personhood, not loopholes in copyright law. Using someone's voice, or a convincing replica of it anyways, should require explicit permission. Style imitation in music should be recognized not just as influence, but as labor that can be exploited when automated at scale. And finally, ethical AI law should acknowledge power imbalance. Individual artists can't negotiate with multinational, multi-billion-dollar tech companies on equal footing, right? That means protections have to be structured, not optional. Collective rights, default safeguards, and enforceable limits are not barriers to innovation. They're what make innovation legitimate. The goal isn't to freeze culture in place. It's to ensure the future of creativity includes the people who built it. Because a system that can only function by stripping creators of agency is not sustainable. And a law that treats human expression as disposable training material is not neutral. Ethical AI is not about slowing progress. It's about deciding who progress is for. At its core, this debate is not about technology. It's about ownership. For centuries, ownership in art and music meant something very, very simple. If you made it, you had a say in how it was used. Not absolute control, right? But recognition, agency, and the right to refuse. That understanding really did shape copyright and contracts and creative labor itself. But generative AI really challenges that idea, not by accident, but by design. When systems can absorb culture wholesale, when style can be extracted without attribution, and when identity can be replicated without consent, ownership really becomes a theoretical thing. The law still speaks the language of authorship, but it enforces the logic of extraction. And that contradiction does matter. Because if creators no longer own the product of their labor in any meaningful sense, right, then creativity becomes a resource to be mined, not a resource to be respected. Art stops being a conversation between humans and other humans, and it becomes raw material that systems optimize for scale. And it's not a distant future, it's already happening. Artists are being asked to accept displacement as destiny, and musicians are being told that their voices are just another data set. And the law, rather than acting as a safeguard, is standing behind technicalities and calling them neutrality. But neutrality is a choice, and so is progress. The question isn't whether AI will be part of our creative future, it already is. The real question is whether the future will treat human creatives as collaborators or as fuel. And once ownership loses meaning, the damage spreads far beyond culture, because once we decide that consent doesn't matter, it rarely stops at art. If creativity is the sum of human experience, right, then protecting it isn't resistance to the future. It's responsibility for it.